Welcome back. In our time this morning, we were able to begin our review for the Torts summative assessment. During that time, we were able to cover the first defense, which is the doctrine of contributory negligence. We were also able to discuss the rebuttal to the contributory negligence defense, which is that of the last clear chance doctrine. We started with comparative negligence before we ended, but then we had a couple of questions. And just so that there's a clear transition from contributory negligence to comparative negligence, we're going to start comparative negligence here. Pure negligence allows a contributorily negligent plaintiff to recover some portion of his or her damages as long as a defendant's negligence was a proximate cause of the injuries. Got it? Pure comparative negligence allows a contributorily negligent plaintiff to recover some portion of his or her damages as long as the defendant's negligence was a proximate cause of the injury suffered by the plaintiff. Okay. The damages that the plaintiff receives will be reduced by whatever percentage the jury assigns to the negligent plaintiff. The plaintiff's reward, the plaintiff's damages will be reduced by the percentage of fault that the jury assigns to the plaintiff. Again, speaking pure comparative negligence. I am 40% negligent. The defendant is 60% negligent. I sue. I am able to establish my prima facie case of negligence against the defendant. The defendant doesn't have any defenses or fails in any defenses that he raises. I get a verdict for $10 because I am 40% negligent. I can only get 60% of the damage from the defendant. See what happened? My reward, award, is reduced by the 40%. Okay. Excellent. Let's move on. One more time. Pure comparative negligence allows a contributorily negligent plaintiff to recover some portion of his or her damages as long as a defendant's negligence was a proximate cause of the injuries suffered. Got it? Here's a question. Not going to do the poll since we're not live, but I had a poll question set up here like we did for the other two poll questions this morning. Question. Richard is involved in a collision at sea when his cargo ocean vessel strikes Joanna's cargo vessel. Both vessels are damaged. Both vessels were being steered carelessly, but Richard is 70% responsible. Joanna is 30% responsible. There is a cross suit. That means Richard as a plaintiff sues Joanna as the defendant, and Joanna as the plaintiff sues Richard as the defendant. What will be the outcome under a rule of pure comparative negligence / responsibility? A, Richard and Joanna will each be found 50% at fault. Richard cannot recover because he is more than 50% at fault. Joanna is 30% at fault and can recover from Richard. Richard will recover 30% and Joanna will recover 70%. Neither Richard nor Joanna will be able to recover. The correct answer is C, pure comparative negligence. Pure comparative negligence. If you have a question about that, please reach out. All right, let's move to assumption of the risk. Assumption of the risk. Remember, when we talk about assumption of a risk, we have expressed assumption of the risk and implied assumption of the risk. Expressed assumption of the risk and implied assumption of the risk. Expressed assumption of the risk is generally going to be done via a written agreement. That is not 100% the case in life. That is 100% of the case in a test for Professor Washington. Okay. Agreements wherein the plaintiff accepts risk created by the defendant's activities. Again, almost all involve written releases. In the case of a summative test, it will involve a written release. In exchange for this promise not to sue by plaintiff, the defendant provides a service or a product to the plaintiff. Are these agreements enforceable? From a big picture perspective, what do we look at? We look at two things. We look at public policy and we look at the specificity of the actual agreement. Number one, is the waiver of liability consistent with what public policy should be? If it is the waiver of liability as it is specifically written in this particular case gonna pass muster? Well, let's look, because when it is a testing situation, we're really paying more attention to the latter, which is let's look at the specificity of this agreement. Expressed assumption of the risk is a contract matter. That's why when we start to look at the terms of a specific agreement, it looks more like a contract analysis, right, than a torts analysis. And that's because expressed assumption of the risk is a matter of contract. Yeah, matter of contract. So, not in contracts, we're in torts. What are we going to do with expressed assumption of the risk? Remember the Turnbow v. Ladner case? Turnbow v. Ladner. That's the case. Scuba diver wants to get recertified as a scuba diver. Ladner, who was providing the classes, said you have to sign a waiver. Turnbow said, a little nervous about this whole signing waiver thing. Turnbow spoke with someone who was in the class who happened to just be a lawyer. Lawyer said, sign the agreement. These things are generally busted. What do I mean by that? These things are not usually enforced. What do I mean by that? There's usually either a public policy reason not to enforce these agreements, or there's going to be something specifically lacking with the particular agreement, right? Looking at it as a contract that's going to prevent a court from enforcing it. What was going on with Turnbow? We've got the agreement, says, I'm going to teach you how to scuba. You promise not to sue me. Great. I promise not to sue you if you teach me how to scuba. Great. Went out to scuba, did a couple of dives, and Turnbow became really ill, right? Decompression sickness can be a lifelong permanent disorder if it's severe enough. In this particular case, it was severe enough. Turnbow soon sued Ladner. Ladner filed a response. So slow down. Let's slow the action down. Turnbow files a lawsuit alleging negligence. Turnbow establishes duty of care, breach of duty, actual cause, legal cause, damages. She wins. Turnbow wins, right? Yeah. No, Turnbow doesn't win because Ladner then asserts an assumption of the risk. Boom. You signed a waiver agreeing not to sue me, right? So there to your negligence. Turnbow said, yeah, there's something that stinks about this, because Turnbow had an expert that said Ladner didn't even meet the minimum standard of care that's expected. So you don't get to go out there and be reckless. or grossly negligent or willful or wanton. You don't go out there and say, you're not going to sue me, so I can be abusive in all of these kinds of ways. Right? Because in essence, that's almost what Ladner seems to think. And the court says, that's not how this works. Remember, court said, that's not how this works. With an expressed assumption of the risk, right? If it is reduced to writing, you're going to have to establish that the risk that are being waived, you have to establish that the risk or risks with an S that the defendant is willing to accept have to be risk S, right? That don't squarely stand in the face of public policy, right? We don't want you to waive risk that seem to be so fundamental to life, right? So the risk have to be clearly articulated, clear, precise, understandable language. Do you really know what you're waiving? Do you really understand what it is that the plaintiff is saying they're willing to allow the defendant to do? Well, can the negligent acts that are being waived be acts that can be contemplated? Can the negligent acts that are being waived be acts that can be contemplated? Well, now that I understand that the risks have to be clear, concise, understandable language, what else about this agreement do I need to look forward to or look into? Does the agreement allow negotiation of the parties? Does the agreement allow the parties to negotiate? I will teach you how to hold your breath underwater for 60 seconds if you agree not to sue me. I will agree not to sue you if you teach me to hold my head underwater for 60 seconds, provided, right? Provided that you're doing the minimum, right? Provided that you're not pushing my head under the water, keeping me from coming up, right? Something outrageous. Yeah. What are the intentions of the parties in light of the circumstances that currently exist? Excuse me. What are the intentions of the parties in light of the circumstances that currently exist? Can the negligent acts being claimed have been contemplated at the time of the signing of the agreement? Right. Expressed assumption of the risk does not intend you to assume someone's negligence just for the sake of negligence, right? Does not intend for you to assume someone's negligence just for the sake of negligence. Let's go to implied. We have expressed assumption of the risk and we have implied assumption of the risk. Implied assumption of the risk has a primary branch and it has a secondary branch. Implied assumption of the risk has a primary branch and a secondary branch. What's the primary? Primary assumption of the risk under implied has nothing to do with an individual's knowledge of risk or interest in giving up the ability to sue. Wait, what? So It doesn't require me to know what my risks are. And it doesn't require me to give up so exactly what is implied primary assumption of the risk? Implied primary assumption of the risk describes a situation in which a court concludes or a state statute maintains that a defendant has no duty to the plaintiff, right? Because the activity is such that its very nature is inherently dangerous. Its very nature, the activity is dangerous. We didn't cover any implied primary, so don't spend a lot of time trying to discern between implied primary and implied secondary. We didn't spend the time there. Why am I talking about it? I'm talking about it so that you know that there's two branches, right? So that there's no confusion. There's two branches, but as to what could be tested of the two branches, it's going to be secondary, right? It's going to be secondary assumption of the risk that's implied because that's what we have studied. So let's stop spending time on primary and let's look at secondary. What's implied secondary? Implied secondary requires a subjective test. What are the elements? And here's the subjectivity. What are the elements? Number one, the plaintiff actually knows of the risk. That's element one. That's the subjective. This plaintiff knows, not just a reasonable plaintiff would know. This plaintiff knows of the risk. Number two, this plaintiff actually appreciates the risk. Number three, after knowing the risk and appreciating the risk, this plaintiff voluntarily exposes themselves to the risk created by the negligent conduct of the defendant. What's number four? It was objectively unreasonable for the plaintiff to expose themselves to the risk, which is what would make a normal implied secondary assumption of the risk a implied secondary qualified assumption of the risk. All right. So just for clarity, let's set it up this way. Elements for implied secondary assumption of the risk. Number one, plaintiff actually knows. Number two, plaintiff actually appreciates. Number three, plaintiff still volunteers exposure. Plaintiff actually knows, plaintiff actually appreciates, plaintiff still voluntarily exposes themselves to the risk, right? That is implied secondary. What is implied secondary qualified? Implied secondary qualified is plaintiff actually knows, plaintiff actually appreciates, plaintiff voluntarily exposes themselves, and that voluntary exposure is unreasonable. Sit with it for a minute, and let's move on. Assumption of the risk is a complete bar to recovery if the jurisdiction has not folded into it comparative negligence. Assumption of the risk is a complete bar, which means if I have a plaintiff that establishes a prima facie case of negligence, and then I have a defendant who says, secondary assumption of the risk, right? Secondary assumption of the risk. You actually knew about the risk. You actually understood the depth of the risk. You voluntarily put yourself there. Anyway, you are barred. Only if the jurisdiction has not folded assumption of the risk into comparative negligence. Okay, spend some time with this slide. There's a lot of people who are going to be saying, oh, I'm confused. Spend some time with the slide. Assumption of the risk is not a complete bar to plaintiff recovery if the jurisdiction has folded it into comparative negligence. Think about it. If we have a comparative negligence doctrine, what does comparative negligence say? Pure comparative negligence says I can have a plaintiff who's negligent who can still recover, right? I can have a plaintiff who's also negligent who can still recover. If assumption of the risk is folded in to the comparative negligence, what does that mean? It means that I have a negligent plaintiff who can still recover because I've got comparative negligence, right? Pure comparative negligence. My plaintiff can be negligent and still recover. So, what role then would assumption of the risk play if it's been folded into the doctrine of comparative negligence? The consent becomes a factor to be considered and how you assess the damage against the plaintiff and the defendant. The consent becomes a factor, right? Because I know in a comparative negligence jurisdiction, I can have a plaintiff who's guilty who can still recover. So, how much do they recover? Well, we're going to factor some things in there. One of the things we're going to factor in is going to be consent. Now, if I'm in a jurisdiction where comparative negligence has not engulfed, has not subsumed, right, is not taking over the assumption of the risk, but the assumption of the risk is still allowed to stand as a separate defense, then assumption of the risk is going to be a complete bar. All right, very good. Here's a question. Assumption of the risk. Ready? Take your time. Friends arrange a drag race. Quiet part of town, late at night. Everyone's been drinking, driving erratically. Racer asked his friend if she would wave a flag to start the race and declare a winner. Friend knows it's dangerous, right? Knows it's dangerous to be standing out there after seeing all the swerving cars. She knows the potential risk that she's going to be taking as a result of the negligent conduct of all of the drivers, right? But she says, let's go. Seems like fun. I'm going to do it. I am going to actually know about this risk. I'm going to actually appreciate the depth of danger that I'm going to put myself in. But dag blabbit, I'm going to do it anyway because it seems like it's going to be fun. Soon after the race starts, the racer accidentally swerves into the flagger, knocking her over, breaking her bones. In a jurisdiction that has folded in secondary implied assumption of the risk, what should the jury compare in the flagger's negligence in a case assigning shares of responsibility? Get it? The jury should compare the racer's negligence with the flagger's negligence. The jury should compare the racer's negligence with the flagger's consent. The jury should compare the racer's negligence with the flagger's negligence and consent. The jury should not compare if the racer has more fault than the flagger. Where are we? Comparative negligence. The jury should compare the racer's negligence with the flagger's negligence. Okay. Okay. That overlooks the assumption of the risk piece, right? B. The jury should compare the racer's negligence with the flagger's consent. Doesn't seem like it's apples and apples, does it? The jury should compare the racer's negligence with the flagger's negligence and consent. Ding, 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 ding. Why is that the right answer? Let's go back. Assumption of the risk, not a complete bar. If it's folded in, if assumption of the risk is folded in to comparative negligence, what happens? The consent now becomes a factor to be considered. Where is it considered? It's considered right there when the jury's making a determination of how much is going to be allotted to the plaintiff as fault and how much is going to be allotted to the defendant. That is assumption of the risk. One last question and we're done with this slide. We're done with this PowerPoint. A worker takes a job with a landscaper clearing debris from a roadside after a mudslide. As he begins working, the worker sees that the large rocks are still rolling down the hill. He complains to the landscaper, who responds, "Hey, if you don't want to be paid, don't work. If you want to be paid, keep working. You decide." The worker keeps working and is soon hit by a boulder, giving him a concussion. The worker sues the landscaper for negligence, and the jurisdiction follows traditional rules for secondary implied assumption of the risk. This means that the secondary implied assumption of the risk doctrine has not been, there's a typo, has not been folded into any comparative negligence doctrine. So it stands alone. When it stands alone, what is assumption of the risk? It is a complete bar when it stands alone, when it has not been folded into. What, if anything, can the worker recover from the landscaper? The worker can recover nothing. The worker can recover damages reduced to account for his negligence. The worker can recover damages reduced to account for his consent. The worker can recover all his damages. The answer is the worker can recover nothing. Why? Because in this jurisdiction, as clearly stated in this question, the assumption of the risk doctrine has not been folded in. And when it's not folded in, what is it? It's a complete bar. That's the end. That's contributory negligence. That's comparative negligence pure. That's assumption of the risk. That's the end. Look forward to seeing you guys on Wednesday via Zoom to discuss Torts Review Part 2. Looking forward to it. Thank you, and I will chat with you guys soon.